Welcome to The Bee's Knees. I'm your host, JC Meyer. The Bee's Knees is a podcast wild about native bees. Wild and native bees are under threat worldwide. In each episode, we look at actionable things we can do to support these adorable little guys whose pollination work is crucial for maintaining biodiversity. Thanks for being here. We don't talk much about honeybees at The Bee's Knees, and that's deliberate. Native and wild bees are hugely important to biodiversity and ecosystem function. And I believe, considering their level of importance, there's a distressing lack of information and conversation surrounding them. In many parts of the world, the honeybee is an introduced species, and as any type of introduced species, they compete for resources with the local fauna. However, in some parts of the world, the honeybee is a native species. Today we're going to look at one such native honeybee, whose homeland is one you may not expect, Sweden. A. mellifera, or the Nordic honeybee, is nearly extinct, but breeding and conservation efforts are in full swing. Let's learn more.
My name is Niklasson. I work mainly at Nordic. It's a private foundation. We work with endangered species and ex situ breeding, but also in situ work, which means we work with breeding of species outside of their habitat in a zoo setting, so to speak. We also work a lot with ecological restoration, and I work in particular with the Nordic honeybee, or the dark honeybee, which is a native subspecies of the European honeybee.
So tell me about the Nordic honeybee. Its origins, characteristics, and what is its current status in Sweden?
Where they up is mellifera, the dark one, which is almost totally black. It's not like the archetypical yellow black striped bee. It's more like black or brownish. It used to be the dominant subspecies all over Southern Scandinavia, Central and Western Europe. Had a huge distribution before the advent of the frame bee hive keeping that started in the 1860s, but gradually took over the beekeeping. And with that, we started importing other subspecies. So this import has pushed away the native subspecies over actually in many countries. So this subspecies is extinct in some countries, and it has a very tough situation in Sweden with about 1,000 hives out of 160,000 hives. So it's just a small proportion of honeybees that are the native honeybee today.
So let's discuss your findings into the free-living colonies of the bee. Why did you decide to investigate the bee's local history?
I have a strong interest in forest history and fire history. And when you start to read about the honeybee, you realize that it's actually a forest or a tree species. It is really in most of the temperate areas where you find this honeybee, it's really a tree inhabitant. It's living in trees, in hollow trees. It's by far the majority of the findings are in trees in our colder climates, whereas in the warmer climates, it doesn't need to have the insulation of wood in the winter, so it can live in rock crevices and in other places. So I was always interested in honeybees since I worked with forest history and came across some old testimonies. Like 30 years ago, I was reading old documents, and just by chance I saw these comments on old farmers and old, the self-subsistence people of southern Sweden. They used to come across wild honeybees in the forests, and today we don't hardly see any wild honeybees at all. So that was always, nagging me in my, we say in the Swedish, in the backhead. I don't know how you say in English. It was always there, and how is that possible, And then I came across this super interesting ethnological material that was collected in the 1920s and 30s mainly, and it had been scanned into PDFs recently, so you could find it on the internet, and it was interviews with old beekeepers in Sweden. So it was a combination of interest in both forest history, human use of forests and human use of bees and all these notions of wild bees in the forests. And they don't fit with what you see today when you go out in the forest. You just don't find them. And if you find them, you regard them as something odd, something it shouldn't be there almost, you know.
So, in compiling all this information, what was your biggest takeaway?
Well, it seemed to be, I would say, rather a common species in forests, uh, the honeybees, because indirectly we could, if you say you read between the lines, right, that hollow trees were just so common in the old forest before industrialization of the Swedish forest. You know, Sweden has an extremely efficient forestry, right? It's a type of industrial forestry. I'm a forester myself, my background, but I took an ecological turn quite early. Uh, we are often seen as a trademark for sustainable forestry. In reality, maybe that's not the full truth. If you come here, you will see huge clear cuts, and you actually start to realize that species that need hollow trees or old trees and these kind of habitats, they are actually on the red list or they are almost going extinct. Some woodpeckers are a very good example of that, but they are very rare and they have even gone extinct, also using hollow trees, right? All these documents, they tell you that very likely this honeybee was not regarded as something odd or peculiar or strange or unusual or so, you know. It was, you just went out to the forest, and if you were lucky, you could find a colony in a tree and you chop down this piece and get some honey for free, you know, or the colony, you know, it had a huge value. It's so clear to me that the honeybee was a very, very common species as a wild species, right? And that is for me quite mind blowing when you walk around in the forest today. That you just don't see much of hollow trees. You start to realize that it's very likely that the hollow trees are a crucial factor for the populations in the forest. The number of hollow trees, their properties, their hollow sizes and volumes and so on. It's not every hollow tree that suits a bee colony, right? So that is also very interesting. And it again tells us that hollow trees must have been just everywhere in the forest in the past, right? Just everywhere. And that for me, it gives us a good aim, right? A good future aim where we could strive for having such forests back, where we protect forest and where we restore forest. I think this is a super important take home message, that this is probably what the nature was looking like only 200, 150 years ago, when these interviews usually had the oldest ones, they were born in the 1840s. That's a long time ago. Yeah. So they had experienced a time way before the industrialization of forestry, right? There was no commercially managed forest in the very efficient way of today. There were no plantings over huge areas. You would cut one tree here, one tree there. And so their testimonies, they tell us that until quite recently, these forests were common. And it's for me very, very interesting. And it's another take on why we are sitting in such deep problems with biodiversity in forests in Sweden.
So, talking about kind of bringing back the Nordic honeybee to Sweden, you have breeding stations. How does it work, and what results have you seen?
Yeah, the Nordic honeybee, it started as a rescue program in the late 80s because beekeepers in the 80s started to see that, Jesus, the native dark one is not existing any longer. So if we are going to have our native original genes in our country, we have to do something. So there was an initiative by, for example, Ingvar Arvidsson, but there were many more. And they initiated the breeding station, and it was started up in the biggest lake of Vänern of Sweden. You can see it on most maps. It's quite a large lake. So in the middle of the lake, there's some big islands, and there's the first breeding station. Yeah, they had some problems in the beginning in the late 80s, how to monitor the quality of the breeding. And obviously, for non-specialists, you must have breeding stations in areas which is about, or I would say, no less than 15 kilometers away from any other beekeeper. Either you must stay out in the ocean or in a big lake, or you must be very confident that there are no other beekeepers with other subspecies. We're running this second breeding station in Sweden, out in the ocean, and we have fully pure genes from these matings. Yeah, so we are together with the other big breeding station. We are supplying every beekeeper that wants to have the native Nordic bee. We have to transport everything far, far away. It's an hour and a half with a boat out to the ocean, and it's a very exotic, very touristic archipelago, very extreme environment, but actually lots of nectar flowers out there.
Are there other native bees in Sweden? And what are their status?
Yeah, you have like 250 solitary bees, right? Yeah. So we have one social bee, which is the Apis mellifera. And of course, we have, like in all Europe, about 250 species of solitary bees. Yeah, which is, of course, in terms of number of species, a lot. Yeah. And they are also having tough times. So personally, I work a lot with flora restoration. Because we have here on the zoo where I work, we have a huge piece of land where we are restoring spruce monocultures, which is a common theme in all throughout Europe, in Czech Republic as well. So we are removing spruce monocultures and putting cows back on these. They were used to be grazed grasslands in the past, yeah. But we are trying to get back flowers either by planting or by sowing. It's actually not so simple, I would say. It's a quite hard work. Without having any scientific evidence, we are right now in the peak summer, and together with the beekeepers, I sense that there is a quite strong decline in flowering at the peak summer. Yeah, we have quite good flower resources in the spring and early summer. We have many species. We have dandelion. Oh, that's an important one, right? Everywhere in Europe in the spring. And then we're right in the high summer, we don't have many flowers anymore because the meadows are basically gone. Yeah. Where we produce fodder for cows, it's managed in a way that doesn't give us many flowers. It's a tough situation, actually. For example, I suspect that we are lacking species like the lime tree. Of course, we have lime trees, but they are just around houses and, in just a few trees. And you can see that, of course, they are magnets in July right now, right? So they are super important for bees. It's like the only big resource that we have at this time of the year. So we are going to plant lime trees as well. So we are trying to provide more nectar and pollen resources. It's very hard to produce a lot of flowers. And actually, you can see that urban areas are very, very important for bees. You know that. We know that from scientific papers that it's actually very important because that in urban areas, you keep flowers all throughout spring through the autumn, right? And that's the key for this success in urban areas and many pollinators. So we should not at all underestimate private gardens. I think that's a super important thing, and it's not like naive hope, right? It is very important. We can just agree on that, I think. Yeah.
The story of the Nordic honeybee is so familiar. Removing or adapting natural habitats is detrimental to the species that rely on the resources that habitat provides. Clever interventions, like flying bees to far-off archipelagos to breed, are wonderful, but it is unfortunate that such measures have to be taken. Thanks so much to Mats for sharing this story, and thank you for listening. I appreciate your time, and thank you for caring about our bees. Please visit the beesknees.website to sign up for the Hive, our twice-a-month newsletter, and please follow and rate the show. Until next time, stay sweet.